Hello and welcome to another edition of Preachers on Preaching. I'm Joe Gibbs and I am your host. You know, pulpit preachers always want to relate to the congregation. That is, they want what they have to say about their topic or certainly about their biblical text to relate to the lives of those who are listening. And yet sometimes we have a hard time getting a text that's 2,000 years old into the life of someone who's living in the middle of a pandemic or whatever it is. And one way that we can bring those barriers down or cross that bridge is with humor. And I had a great opportunity to talk to the Reverend Aaron Zimmerman, a friend of mine, who is the rector of St. Albans in Waco, Texas. And he's a pretty naturally funny guy, but he's also very thoughtful and he uses humor strategically, and he is very effective. I hope you enjoyed this great conversation that I had with Aaron Zimmerman about relatability through humor. Aaron Zimmerman, rector of St. Albans Church in Waco, Texas. It is great to be with you on this episode of what I'm calling right now, Preachers on Preaching. How about that? Hey, Aaron, we're gonna have a good conversation today about pulpit preaching. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are and sort of what things you're into there in Waco?
I'm one of your proteges in that I've known you a very long time, and I met you when I was in high school. I think our viewers, just full disclosure, need to know that you shaped me at a very young age. We were then seminary classmates together. I'm now the rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church. Yeah, totally cool. Rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church in Waco, Texas, and I've been here for 7 years and loving it. Yeah. What else do you need to know? You're
married to someone who's much better than you, and you've got some children, some offspring. Tell us about that.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Andrea and I have 3 arrows in our quiver. They are. We have a girl who's a junior in high school, and then a high school freshman boy, and then a boy in middle school. So yeah, it's busy times in the Zimmerman household. We have a dog, a golden doodle, as well, named Lucky.
All right. Well, I may be the most jealous of that. Tell me, Aaron, who would you say has been the biggest influence on your preaching, and why?
3 people. I would say Robin Williams, Stephen Colbert, and Paul Zoll. So I spent a lot of time as a kid watching VHS tapes of Robin Williams that I don't know who bought or why we had them, because they were definitely not appropriate for children. But Robin Williams is really funny, and I think he was the first person that I really remember kind of captivating an audience, and we'll hopefully talk about this later, but kind of showed me how to use humor. I think Stephen Colbert, because he has, in his Colbert Report personality, had this ironic, winking way of communicating with people, which I think is, for people that have kind of come of age in the last 20, 30 years, that style of communication, I think, has become more common, and I think it's kind of the common language that a lot of people understand in public communication. The days of sort of like the earnest, leaning over the pulpit, extending a hand, kind of Billy Graham style, that can still work in some contexts, but I think there's kind of an earnestness in that was sincere at the time, but has become suspect now. And so Colbert's ironic presentation and using irony effectively to communicate, I think, was an important lesson for me. And then Paul Zoll. So he was the dean of the seminary. He's now where we attended, and is a retired Episcopal priest with many years of experience. And when I got to seminary, he was the first person that I ever had seen preach that did two things that I think were really effective. One, he showed me that it was okay to acknowledge with the congregation the reality of what was going on in the sermon. So when a joke failed or didn't land, to sort of comment on that and turn that into, to name the awkwardness of the moment and use that as a bridge to what was important to say next. In a sense, to kind of break the fourth wall and to acknowledge, okay, what we're doing here is this sort of contrived form of communication and conversation, and we can actually talk about that too. And by the way, that's something Jim Gaffigan, another famous comedian, does all the time. He'll make a joke, and then he'll take the voice of his audience. You can't say that. He's gonna get in trouble for that. And so he comments on his own joke and allows people to kind of process whatever awkward moment he's created. So Paul did that very well. But I think also what Paul showed me is that is how to talk about. There's a lot of things. I said there's two main things, and I'm thinking there's probably like seven more. But I'll just say two, and we'll leave it at that. To talk about the psychological reality of life. So a lot of preachers will say, this is a biblical text. Let me unpack it for you and give you an application and something you need to do. And what Paul always did was to talk about, whether he used humorous terms, popular cultural terms, or psychological terms, to talk about the inner angst of the human heart, the deep longings, the fears, the despair, the guilt, all of that stuff, and to name it, and then to say what the text has to say about that situation. So just kind of that deep psychological excavation was something that I learned.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like because we're both from the same school, in a sense, that I almost don't notice that that's something that was learned. I mean, it's just something that you got to do. So that's helpful.
Right.
A good reminder for me. You have been. I think you're known as a preacher. I'm sure you have, like all of us, you have many other skills in the quiver that you have to bring out pastorally, administratively. But you're
computer hacking skills, bow staff skills.
Right. Yeah. That's for the other podcast. But I think that I mean you're on the Mockingbird, the Mocking Pulpit podcast, and probably others as well. Pretty regularly. Why do you, I mean, preaching is something that you've worked on and are known for. Why do you feel that preaching is such an important task rather than just maybe another part of the liturgy?
That is a great question. And your question, why is preaching so important and not just another part of the liturgy? What bums me out when you say that is to know that there are many people in our tradition or other liturgical or sacramental traditions. This is not true in the non-denominational world and some other parts of the Protestant world. There are people who would disagree with the statement that the sermon is one of the most important parts of the service. There are people that do see it almost as an afterthought because the sacrament is so important, as it is, but nevertheless, the sermon, in survey after survey after survey, across denominational lines, is rated by the people in the pews as being one of or the most important part of the service for them, and has the biggest influence on why they pick one church versus another. So it is really important. And the reason I think it's so important, especially in a liturgical context, like us in the Episcopal Church, or Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, and 5 Methodist churches. The reason it's so important is because it is the one way. It's really the one time in the service where you can have a personal word that's directed at the listener. And to be sure, there is communication happening from God to the preacher, from God to the listener, and from the listener and the preacher, hopefully, to God, praying as the sermon is happening. But it's really the one part in the service where the listener, the congregation, feels directly addressed, and it's the place where people can feel spoken to, they can feel heard, they can feel seen. And the reason so many sermons, I think, fall flat is because they don't deal with that reality. They sort of are a voice from on high, as opposed to realizing this is a part of the sermon to speak directly to people. And so everything else kind of feels churchy, and it's really easy to tune that out. I mean, I love the liturgy, you love the liturgy, and there's a lot there that for us is deeply meaningful and real. But let's be honest, there are a lot of people who haven't been to church in 10 years. They show up on your doorstep on Sunday, and they don't know the creed from the confession. And all that is just sort of washing over them, and they're just trying not to lose their place and look like they don't know what they're doing, because they have no idea what they're doing, and they're terrified of looking like a fool. But the sermon is the one place they can sit down, they can relax, they don't have to now, what page am I on? And I've never sung this hymn before. And that's the moment where they're now open to hear a divine word directly to them. And I think that's why it's so important.
But given that it's so important, it's not something that necessarily comes naturally to us. We have to work. It's a craft. We ought to be getting better at it. Both in terms of content and structure, but also in delivery. What are some things that you've done to focus on or work on your delivery and how you communicate effectively to folks?
I think back to your first question about who are the people that have influenced my preaching, and 2 of the 3 are not religious communicators in any way, shape, or form, at least not intentionally or overtly so. And I think one of the things that's been most important to me is to find people who I think are really effective communicators. And, the 2 people I mentioned are stand-up comedians. And I think there are many people who've written about how those folks are the preachers for our age, that there's a reason they can sell out. And there's a reason why every time Dave Chappelle records a comedy special, it's the most watched thing on Netflix for a week, because comedians are the last people who can sort of speak truth. People think most preachers are sanctimonious, hypocritical fools and tune them out, but comedians can speak effectively, often about very contemporary and personal and powerful issues. And so I think for me, one of the ways I hone my craft is to watch people out there who are effective communicators and ask myself, why is that so effective? Are there things there that I could apply in my preaching? And so that's one of the things that I've done. I think the other thing that I've done, which is no fun, but it is to watch or listen to yourself. Listen to a recording of a sermon, or watch a video of you preaching, and to learn from that. Because nobody in your congregation will tell you about the annoying, idiosyncratic things you do as you preach, and everybody has them. I mean, maybe there's that person in your parish, and sorry about that. But in general, I mean, if you're a preacher, you have had the experience where after church, you're greeting people in the kind of shaking hands line, and you didn't preach that Sunday, but somebody tells you good sermon. And so what that means is they're not going to be honest with you about your preaching. I find that young clergy, if you're just out of seminary, there'll be about 5 or 6 people in your first year or 2 that might try to give you comments because they've been at the church for 30 years and you've been there for 30 seconds, and they're going to try to take that one moment where you're still a little bit, you haven't fully hardened yet, and they're going to try to mold you. But in general, people are not going to tell you the truth. So if you can watch yourself and ask yourself, would I be interested in this sermon if I were sitting in the pews? Or would there be something the preacher's doing that's distracting me? And there's lots of little things with your hand, like somebody actually did point this out to me in my extended family who watched me preach online, that I sort of do this thing where I twist my wedding ring sometimes. And it's probably just like a nervous little thing, kind of, and I guess it's better than smoking while preaching. But
depends on the audience.
So to learn, to be aware that those are things that I'm doing that may be distracting. So those are 2 things. Watch yourself and watch other people who are effective communicators. And Tim Keller says you have to preach about 200 bad sermons before you start preaching good ones. So I think also giving yourself grace to know that, as you said, it is a craft. It's something you learn. And most of the things that you now do well, you did badly for a very long time. And so just knowing that it's going to take a while to to figure it out.
That's great. Thank you. Well, you've written somewhere, you talked a lot about stand-up comedians. You've written somewhere, I remember for several years ago reading an article that you wrote about how important humor is in sermons as a valuable tool. What do you mean by that?
So yeah, I wrote that article for the Mockingbird magazine, and it was called "The Church is Dying for a Laugh." And I do think that the church is, in many senses, declining in membership and attendance and all that sort of stuff because it is so humorless. It feels to many people judgmental and holy in a way that is off-putting. True holiness is really something that draws people in, but the way the church presents it in sort of almost many times, sometimes this is fair characterization, sometimes it's a little bit undeserved, but can be perceived as sanctimonious and all that. So because of that, you are starting in a hole as a preacher. People that have come to church, for the most part, if they are not longtime members, and by the way, there are fewer and fewer longtime members, and if you have a growing congregation, that means, and if you want to grow a congregation, it means you're going to have to start attracting people who have not been in church for a long time. And when they walk in, there's anxiety, there's nervousness. Again, especially in the Episcopal Church, where you have to worry about, do I sit? Do I stand? Why are people crossing themselves? Why is that person taking a knee before they enter the pew? Did they lose a contact? What's happening? And so all these things are going on, and you have an anxious congregation that's also had a horrible fight in the car ride over to church, and they're just hoping their kids will make it through the service. So with all this anxiety, humor is the thing that disarms people. It makes them realize that this person preaching is a human being, I'm a human being, and I can lower my guard a little bit and hear something that might communicate to me. It also very much makes the preacher a human being, as opposed to the voice of God coming from the pulpit. I have this idea that I stole from a comedian, Pete Holmes, and I think he probably borrowed the term from somebody else. He says, good comedy is often a benign violation. So you violate the rules of common communication, but it's not malicious, it's not vulgar, it's a benign violation. It's kind of breaking the rules. So if you get up in the pulpit and the first thing you say is, as St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, that's exactly what they're expecting, and you've immediately lost a lot of your people, because they don't know who St. Paul is, and they don't know what Corinthians are. They think it's some Belgian beer. And but if you get up there and you say, as Prince said in Purple Rain, blah, 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 and maybe that dates me, I'm a not 80s and 90s music freak, but if you begin with something that they're not expecting, a benign violation of the preacher rules to begin with a Bible passage or whatever, then you've gotten, that's a way, that's sort of, there's something funny about that. And so it's a risk to talk about humor in the pulpit. They always say when you dissect a joke, it loses all humor. It's sort of like dissecting a hummingbird to see how it works. Like, now you understand how it works, but you've kind of ruined the hummingbird. Yeah, but I think it's really important to lower people's emotional defenses so that they can then hear what you're trying to say.
It's interesting what you said earlier about, for instance, Dave Chappelle. Like, I've kind of always thought that people were just drawn to the crassness of it and this sort of low-level intellect. But what you're saying is actually that just kind of speaks. It doesn't have that's an unfair characterization, and what they're actually interested in is true commentary. And I think what you're saying now is that the humor actually lets them get ready to hear the truth. Is that what you're?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's right. So people don't like being preached at. People don't like being told how to think. And comedians, the best comedians, are really good at getting people to question their assumptions and think about things and look at the world in a slightly different way by using humor. And this has been true from Richard Pryor to Robin Williams to Chris Rock and to Dave Chappelle, but also John Mulaney. Lots of Whitney Cummings and Whoopi Goldberg, like all these comics, I think the crassness is often something, it makes people feel, it makes the audience feel like, oh, this is just a normal person. This is not going to be a preachy, judgmental kind of thing. It sort of makes them, it gives them permission to be in this place. And nobody's going to make fun of them for going to, like if you went to a public lecture about race in America today, your friends might think that's a pretty lame way to spend a Friday night unless you live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so, but if you're going to see Dave Chappelle, that must be cool because he cusses a lot and he makes kind of vulgar jokes. But actually what Dave Chappelle is doing in most of his things is talking about gender, race, economics, class, politics, all that stuff. He's talking about it. And I think the crassness is a little joke with his audience where they can all pretend they're the cool kids like smoking in the parking lot, but actually it's a Bible study. But you can't tell them that because they won't ever come. So I think that's one of the things that I think is happening is effective. Now, I don't think a preacher should swear in the pulpit. I think vulgarity in the pulpit is not a good idea. But I think there are ways that you can be funny. You can touch that vein a little bit. You can be a little just a touch of not sacrilege, but just some humor in that, and it can be very effective.
It's unexpected, I guess.
Yes.
What about physical humor, like Sebastian Maniscalco or Brian Regan or these guys? I mean, do you ever do anything like that?
Yeah.
I think that would make me very uncomfortable.
I do sometimes. I mean, vestments are also very funny. You have to, and you know this because we've all seen The Princess Bride, where the clergyman, the bishop doing the wedding, stands up there and marriage is what brings us together today, and he's wearing just ridiculous vestments, and they were ridiculous then. They're sort of ridiculous now, and so there are times when I'm gesturing wildly and the wings on my surplice are flapping, and I'll occasionally say something about that. It's really good to talk about that in children's sermons, by the way, to just kind of, isn't this funny that I'm wearing this thing? It looks like I have wings. The other thing, though, one time I referenced either the Four Tops or the Temptations or one of those kind of Motown groups, and they're famous for their dance moves. And I did a little 360 in the pulpit. It was not planned. It was, I don't know whether it was a movement of the Spirit or whatever, but I said something about the Temptations, and I, did a little spin. And it just lowered the temperature. It lowered the anxiety temperature in the room. People just sort of got a kick out of it. And it's just sort of funny to see a priest spinning in the pulpit. So, there are some physical things you can do. If you're in a congregation when you're not in a pulpit, and you can move around the stage or the whatever that dais is, that can be effective as well. I just would say be careful of it because everybody's different, but having to kind of follow a preacher, track a preacher who's moving around all over the place can get a little bit exhausting. So I'd say use that sparingly. But your physical presence is important. I mean, there are some times where I lean over, but I think the key thing is, for me at least, to do it from a place of authenticity. When I'm leaning over to make a dramatic point, I'm not thinking, I'm leaning over to make a dramatic point. I really care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's important. I mean, you're really caring for the people and trying to meet them where they are for their own good.
Yeah.
Not for your pats on the back and for people to tell you that you're funny. So here's the $1 million question, though. If someone does not perceive themselves to be funny, or is watching this but has 5 years in the pulpit where they are historically not funny at all, can they learn to be funny? Do you think that's just something that comes naturally, or is that some? And if it doesn't come naturally, we're sort of condemned or to boredom, or can we actually learn to be funny?
I think so. I mean, none of us were born able to walk, and we all figured that one out. And I think, although some of us do it better than others, I suppose, I think, like anything, there's going to be a mixture of natural inclination, but also it absolutely can be learned. There are plenty of people with natural talent that never do anything to hone it, and there are plenty of people with maybe less pure natural talent, but they work really hard at playing the piano and become a great pianist. So, I think I think it can be learned. I think everybody I would encourage preachers to find people that they think are funny and use that as something as a place to begin experimenting in the pulpit. And you don't have to because the other thing is you don't want to overdo it. It's not like joke after joke after joke. You're not trying to be a stand-up comedian. You want to use it effectively. I think it's really effective at bringing people in initially and maybe regaining their attention about halfway through before you make your big point. Kind of wake them up after they've dozed off a little bit. And I think so you don't have to be the funniest person ever. You don't have to have joke after joke. I think just even after you've finished your sermon outline or manuscript or whatever, ask yourself, is there something in here? Reread it again and ask with the question in mind, like, is there something in here where something funny could be said? Or is there something that strikes me as funny in this text? A lot of it is just giving yourself permission to find the humor that's already there. St. Peter in the book of Acts, of course we're not drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that's almost already the joke. If anyone's ever been to a tailgate for college football. There's a lot that's... so yes, I think you can learn it. I think you can also, if you do know somebody who is a person who is funny, you can... If you're a brave soul, ask them to look at one of your sermons and say, are there things in there that I could have done or said? And once you see it, it's sort of like those, if you look at the picture, do you see two vases, or is a vase or two people looking at each other? Do you see an old woman or a young woman? And once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it. And I think learning to see the places where humor can work in a sermon is effective. And like I said at the beginning, watch stand-up comics. Find ones that speak to you and use that as a place to learn some ideas, and listen to or watch preachers that you think are effective.
So recently, because I knew we were going to have this conversation, I was writing a sermon and I kind of wrote a piece with Jim Gaffigan's voice.
Yeah.
And I thought, it flopped. I mean, it did not go anywhere. So I resorted to the looking aside to my assistant and said, "Man, I just thought that was going to be funnier," and that was funny.
Yes.
It's always funny
Yes.
when you. Well, this is really helpful, and I think that this is. I hope that we can realize that it is okay in church to laugh. If we preach about love and joy, but it always looks sad and dour. Mm-hmm. Then that is going to drive people away. But I think you're right. I think humor can bring folks in. Well, Aaron Zimmerman, thank you so much for this great conversation, and we look forward to listening to you on the Mocking Pulpit and other places and laughing our heads off.
I will say that cheap plug time. Jacob Smith and I have a podcast called Same Old Song, which walks through the lectionary every week and talks about the passages for the upcoming Sunday. This is for preachers or lay people that want to learn about what the Bible says, and we do sometimes talk about ways to use humor in sermons. So Same Old Song is the podcast, and you can find that wherever fine podcasts are distributed.
Same Old Song. Well, I imagine just listening to you and Jacob Smith, that's in for a few laughs as well. So.
Just as edifying as I
Thanks, brother.